Welcome back to the Daily Drum on WHUR and Sirius XM Channel 141. I'm Harold Fisher. It's been 2 days since an assassination attempt on the life of former President Donald Trump. And there are still a lot of unanswered questions about this incident in Butler, Pennsylvania, just 30 miles north of Pittsburgh. And tonight, we're talking about the incident, the many questions, and what this may mean going forward for the investigation and politically. My guests are Dr. Tyrone Powers, former FBI agent, and Dr. Matthew Dallek, political historian and professor of political management at George Washington University. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining this really important conversation.
Thank you for having me.
Sure thing. Let me start with what we know so far. Suspected shooter Thomas Matthew Crooks, nursing home aide, 20 years old. He was shot and killed by Secret Service. And so far, the reporting is, and what the law enforcement officials are saying, is that he acted alone. Tyrone, let me start with you. From your perspective, did the Secret Service drop the ball here?
Well, a couple of things. In the aftermath of the shooting, they were on point. And in fact, to be quite frank with you, former President Trump was on point, because prior to any of these incidents, as they talk to candidates and presidents and former presidents, anyone they're protecting, they tell them immediately to get down. So before Secret Service even hopped up on the stage, the president was heading towards the crouch position, and then Secret Service did their job. When they come at you, you become not the president or the former president or the protectee. They come at you really hard, almost if they're linebackers and you're a running back. We saw that with the attempt on the assassination of Ronald Reagan. So that point went fine. Then they kept him down, because what we've learned in these situations, other attempted assassinations, not only here in the United States, but across the world, is that the first person may be the distraction and the second person is the assassin. So you can't really move the president immediately, especially when you are, or the former president, when you're in an outside area, because you're thinking there may be another shooter. So based on the history of these events, they know that in an open rally place like that, that you have to wait to move. The president the former President Trump is a hard target to protect, because he doesn't go along with the script after that, raising his hand, yelling to the audience. What the Secret Service would like to do is to keep him low, move him quick, and not have him put his head up. You hear him talking about grabbing my shoes. All of that makes it a difficult job for the Secret Service, because they want to keep him low, move him towards the truck. No more words, no more statements, no standing up, no pumping your fist. Let's just move. And they don't really care that it's the president or a former president. That is their protocol. Prior to the event, the fact that this person was able to get onto a roof outside of there there'll be consequences and repercussions for that, because clearly that's a hole in the security apparatus. Mm-hmm. They won't never give us we probably won't ever get the full story about that, because they hate to identify all the failures, because it allows others to assess weaknesses in security, and those others could be other individuals who are unhinged, individuals who are part of organizations, or individuals who are part of terrorist organizations. So we will get an explanation about what happened, but we won't ever get the full explanation, because part of the strategy is that even though there was a weakness and there was a problem with the way this happened, the fact that he was on the roof, the fact that they didn't have drones up, the fact that this was an outside rally, they don't want to identify either to the public or to the other ears in the public who don't have the intention of just wanting the information, because we're a democracy. They don't want to identify weaknesses, but those responsible for the breach or not being on point, there'll be consequences and repercussions for them that we'll never hear about.
Matt, you've been an observer of American history and politics for many, many years. I have covered political conventions, have been to rallies where presidents or future presidents, candidates, were there. And even from the casual observer, we're talking about 150 yards away from former President Trump. And there was video, people saying, "Look, there's somebody on the roof." 150 yards is really, really not that far away.
Well, especially when you have a high-powered assault rifle, right?
Yeah.
So, look, I'm clearly this person, this would-be assassin, should never have been allowed to get on that roof. And I think the Secretary of Homeland Security came out today and said, no one should have a clear kind of line of fire at the president, a former president, any person protected. Having said that, though, and this is not to make an excuse for anybody, but it's very hard to protect a president or former president. I mean, if we just think about historically, even John F. Kennedy riding in a motorcade, there were a lot of threats against him in Dallas, and in fact, some people said, "Don't come to Dallas." There were posters in the city saying "wanted for treason." And he was obviously shot in the head in Dallas. Gerald Ford in 1975, there were actually 2 attempts on his life, 17 days apart in September 75. And the second person who tried to shoot him, she had her weapon confiscated by law enforcement because she was making threats so erratic. And then she somehow went out and got a new weapon. And she took a shot at him as he was exiting a hotel. This is, not to say that Reagan, of course, in 81, and this is not to say that there are no flaws, in what the Secret Service did. I'm sure there'll be an investigation. There always is. But I mean, I've seen, reports after some of these other, especially the failed attempts, and it feels like, given there are more guns than people have access to these high-powered weapons, and president holding an event in any kind of thousands of people, an open-air rally. This seems particularly egregious, but it just, I think it's a reminder that presidents, former presidents, are really in danger, as are their families.
Yeah, and Tyrone, I'm sure. It doesn't take much, and when you talk about people of a certain age who pay attention to these kinds of things. I was a kid when George Wallace was shot in Laurel, Maryland, when he was campaigning for president, but he was shot in a crowd. Okay, Robert F. Kennedy shot in a hotel kitchen, and we have seen that other presidents, presidential candidates, they want to be able to press the flesh and shake hands with the people, which goes back to what Matt was just saying about how difficult it is to guard candidates, presidents, even ex-presidents. But talk to me about this, because one of the things that really struck me after this incident on Saturday, and I remember in covering the Obama campaign that at some of these rallies, there were people who had AR-15s in the audience in some of these political rallies, because these things were held in open carry states. Help me with this, Tyrone. How is that possible? You've got the law, then you've got protection of this person. How does that work?
Yeah, well, the thing is that Secret Service still can set a perimeter. Let's say you're in an open carry state, they can say no guns within this area. It's a national security issue. Let's be clear, national security issues trump everything. State law, other laws, so on and so forth. So they still can set a perimeter, which I think is some of the questions that's going to be asked here, even in that particular situation. You're right, outdoor rallies are extremely difficult. However, we've had a lot of experience, not only here, but we've had assassinations in countries across the world. You have to remember the federal agencies here have assisted in the investigations of assassinations of Anwar Sadat. So we have a lot of, so when I went through the academy, we began to look at executive protection and how you set things up and perimeters and how to make sure buildings are safe. We didn't do that without looking at all of these other situations. Today, in many cases, for example, at the Super Bowl, at the Major League Baseball World Series, there are drones in the air. So if there's someone on another roof or another location, but what can happen, and again, we won't ever know the full story, but what can happen, because you've had so many of these rallies, you can become a little bit complacent. We saw that with the president in Colombia, where the Secret Service agents were participating with prostitutes in advance of the president arriving. So there are all things that happen. It's not an indictment or a condemnation of the Secret Service, but some individuals in there. And whenever this happened, trust me, they are severely disciplined. In the FBI, you could get disciplined and they would send you from, if you were stationed in the office in Baltimore, Maryland, they would send you to Butte, Montana in 2 weeks. And that's where you had to live and work. So there are some consequences and repercussions that we never know about. However, they should be getting progressively better. And certainly that perimeter should be far out. And certainly the whole point of having counter snipers is in case there is a sniper somewhere, the counter sniper spots them or get communication or get information from a drone and those who are monitoring the drone and say, this person is on this roof, this person have taken the high ground. Everyone who does executive protection know you never give up the high ground. That's why you have helicopters, snipers on roofs, or drones in place. So there's something went wrong here. And I suspect this is not the time for the Secret Service to talk about it on the heels of the Republican National Convention. This is not the time for the Secret Service, the head of the Secret Service, to be giving press conferences. They're dealing with that. But most importantly right now, it's all hands on deck for the Republican National Convention. And I guarantee the people who allowed that breach on this case, and it was a breach, whether they openly admitted or not one to expose weaknesses, are probably not at that Republican National Convention, but they're probably somewhere else doing something else nondescript until that can be dealt with in a different way. But they don't even have the time. They can't take a breath right now. We're in the middle of a campaign season and in the middle of two conventions, the Republican and then the Democratic National Convention. Well, copycat people may be around. So you move with that first.
Yeah. So much more to talk about right now. I'm going to be taking a break in just a bit because, Matt, one of the things I want to talk about the politics of this incident on Saturday, how you believe that could possibly change the rhetoric, what Mr. Trump could be doing. And also I want to drill down a little bit more, Tyrone, after the break about what the investigators will be looking for. So please stay with us. The Daily Drum will continue on Sirius XM channel 141. I'm Harold Fisher. The original Quiet Storm will continue on WHUR in just a bit. This conversation will continue on Sirius XM channel 141 in just a few seconds. Welcome back to the Daily Drum on Sirius XM channel 141. I'm Harold Fisher. Tonight, we're talking about the attempted assassination of former President Donald Trump. My guests are Dr. Matthew Dallek, political historian and professor of political management at George Washington University, and former FBI agent Dr. Tyrone Powers. So, Matt, the Republican National Convention starts today. We have seen some reports and some comments from former President Trump on Truth Social that he's tearing up his heavy speech and is going to try to bring the country together. Certainly, a near-death experience is enough to be a come-to-Jesus moment for any of us, no doubt. But knowing what we know about the former president, and this is the biggest political week for the Republicans. Your thoughts about What do you think the tone will be for the convention this week?
Well, look, I think it's going to be a split. It's going to be a little bit of a two-sided coin. So I think that there will be more efforts to say, let's unite the country, and I think we will hear more of that rhetoric than we otherwise would have. Probably would have heard very little of it prior to this. But as you say, former President Trump has been a candidate for office or a politician for almost a decade now, and he's really an open book. We know how he talks. We know about the conspiracy theories he's embraced, the violent language that he uses, the denigration of people, right? And so, in a way, it's like a little after 9/11, there was a lot of talk of unity, and there was unity, but it didn't last for all that long. Within a couple of months, at least political leaders were going at it in pretty hard ways. I think now it's even more turbocharged because we're in the middle of a presidential campaign. Trump came within an inch of getting killed. The attack also, unfortunately, I think it's unfortunate for all kinds of reasons, but it also feeds this narrative or this conspiracy theory about a deep state kind of conspiring to take Trump out. And I'm sure that there are a lot of conspiracy theories already floating out there that, his protective detail intentionally, right, allowed this to happen when, of course, there's no evidence of that. It's not true. So I don't, whatever we hear at the convention, I don't expect it to be a kind of kumbaya coming together. And I wouldn't be surprised if, day 3 or day 4 of the convention, it's become even more, the rhetoric's become even more charged.
Yeah. Speaking of conspiracy theories, and I want to hear from both of you on this. When this happened on Saturday, and even as I was reporting on this on Saturday evening, almost immediately on social media, I began to see a storm of people from all walks of life begin to talk about the fact that immediately after this happened, that this was staged, that this was not real, that this was something that the former president set up to kind of bolster maybe whether it's a sympathy vote or it was a political ploy ahead of the convention. Your thoughts about why, Matt, do you believe that we initially began to see that before we started to see reports, for example, of the firefighter who was killed, because we didn't know that right away, and the other people who were injured? What, from your perspective, what's going on with America, the political discourse, that something so horrible, so tragic would be considered, a setup?
Yeah. Well, it's I think it's a really sad kind of reality of the political world we live in. Certainly social media fuels some of these conspiracy theories, which are almost always baseless, right? And certainly this one is, totally ridiculous, right? Someone was killed, 2 others were critically injured. Trump had blood coming out. There's, the idea it was staged is just ludicrous. So I think social media, where people can kind of take their information, right? They live in their bubble. It's sort of easier. You're maybe anonymous, right? It's easier to sort of put out these ideas. I think the conspiracy theories often, for at least some people, serve as metaphors. So whether they believe in them, like literally, or not, who knows? But they think, Trump is so devious, right? He could do something like this, right? It just like our enemies to do something like this. Same thing logic goes with Alex Jones when he talked about that horrific shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary School as a false flag operation, right? That this was somehow 19 kids, I think, dead, and this was somehow a fake operation. It wasn't real by liberal gun control activists. So the other point I want to make, though, is that I think that this, for some people in the country, it's also a way of saying that there are these larger forces, especially the government, that is somehow committing evil, right? It's doing evil, and it's also not telling us the truth, right? That there's a kind of hidden force there that because people don't like the government. It's also big. It's impersonal. This idea of a deep state, right? That Trump has talked about often, right? And that has deep roots in American history. But I do think that when the government is involved somehow, it feels like it is more charged. It kind of supercharges these conspiracy theories, and people sink their teeth into it. And it's like, yeah, the government is conspiring to do something nefarious.
Yeah, Tyrone, I in watching these things on social media and hearing people, comment about them, the first thing that came to mind for me, and certainly this was several hours after the fact, when we knew so much more about the people who were hurt, and including the former president and the firefighter who was killed. The first thing that came to my mind was these conspiracy theories aren't helpful. But from your vantage point, I'm sure you saw those same kinds of things.
Yeah, well, the FBI had a philosophy and a training, and when I worked counterintelligence and counterterrorism, is that you rule everything in until you rule everything out. So what does
that mean exactly?
That means that anything is possible and that every angle has to be investigated. So what some people, identify as a conspiracy theory, there is someone who look at that. For example, and history dictates that. We just have social media now. We're still doing movies about who killed Kennedy, who killed Martin Luther King. We're still talking about did Roosevelt know that the attack on Pearl Harbor was going to happen? What happened on 9/11? We're still having discussions of that. The Church Committee came out and talked about the assassinations that the CIA was involved in. There's a new book on the killing of Patrice Lumumba, ordered by President Eisenhower. So there is some fodder for people to have to second guess government, and some of it, if you read the Church Committee report in the 1970s, gained some substance because they came back and said, what we thought was outrageous actually existed. I don't believe that's in this case, but I think in a democracy and a government like this, as long as it doesn't go too far, there's some healthy questioning, even if it seems extreme, as long as it doesn't lead to action, because history dictates that. Again, like I said, there are people who said, Roosevelt allowed the bombing of Pearl Harbor so that the United States become involved in World War II. And, the World Trade Center was an inside job because they had so much information. Of course, the FBI looked at it a different way and said, well, the Russians supplied satellite information based on the U.S. and role in Afghanistan. There's a lot of information that we were to take in, and we were to rule anything in before we ruled everything out. Social media allows that information to come out and those theories to hit, as you said, before we knew anything else, quicker. But there's always been these theories throughout the history of the United States, and every assassination and every attack and every bombing, whether it's Oklahoma City or there's always been, and as an agent, we always knew that was coming, and we didn't automatically discount or mitigate that. It probably was ruled out relatively quickly, but we were not the people to say this is ridiculous. We were the people to say we're going to rule everything in, and then slowly we're going to rule everything out, because that's the best way to conduct investigations.
And I will say, go ahead, Matt. Go ahead.
That's a great point. Actually, 2 points that I think are really, really important. So the government has, of course, conspired at times, right? I mean, they have had conspiracies. Richard Nixon Watergate, right? That was a conspiracy. Rounding up, radicals and immigrants during World War I. The government has been incredibly secretive, right? Especially about national security. So there are real world, it's not simply paranoia, right? There are real world conspiracies, sometimes perpetrated by the government, right? The assassination plots that were just referenced. And these feed into this narrative that, and understandably, right? The other point, though, that I think is really important is the investigation, because obviously the Warren Commission, after Kennedy was killed, the investigation was flawed. All these conspiracy theories, they still exist, right? There's still movies, right, about that. But these investigations, when they're done well, at a minimum, people who are open to reason, right? They can look at the report and they can say, you know what, the attack on the Capitol on January 6th was not an FBI operation, right? Those were not FBI agents who there's no evidence of that, right? But that's why these investigations, which take some time, can push back on some of these, because of course you're right, like the theories should be investigated, they should be ruled out, and the public should be made aware of what the evidence is as to what happened, what the shooter's motivation was.
Well, you mentioned, and I was going to mention this before you did, that there is historical precedent for it, and I think when you're talking about Watergate, which is, I'm a student of it, still reading everything I can about it, but when that happened, that so many people, no matter what you thought of Richard Nixon, said that there is just no way that the most powerful person in the world could possibly be involved in a third-rate burglary of the DNC. I mean, the thought of that was ridiculous. It was preposterous. Why would CREEP, the Committee to Re-elect the President, for those who are not familiar, be involved in such a thing? This is the President of the United States. Well, now we know those conspiracy theories were absolutely true. And there are people who are looking back at the precedents of that and then looking at what happened this weekend, and they're saying at least, because it's giving them some fuel for the fodder, as you were saying, Tyrone. But again, I repeat, I still don't think, considering the loss of life, that any of that is helpful. Let's talk about this investigation. It has now been 2 days, and outside of any mistakes that the Secret Service or other law enforcement officials may have made, let's talk about what they need to do to find out more about this young man, because there just isn't a lot of information out there, Tyrone.
Yeah, the difficulty is this. Usually the Secret Service would be intimately involved in this because the FBI would be talking to Secret Service agencies, everything from security, where he came from, how he walked through the cornfield, how he got transported there, who helped him, who knew he might do this, who is his psychiatrist or therapist, who's his parents, what did they know about it. But the Secret Service had to immediately move on to the Republican National Convention. Mm-hmm. So you're in the midst of an investigation, and you have a lot of questions, and the FBI can send their people to look into the background of this individual to gather all the information they can, but you can't do this in sequential order. Investigations are best done in sequential order, so that way you don't miss the small details, you don't miss anything. Sometimes when you go after it in this wide way, you miss something in there. So what usually happens, you have what certainly after 9/11 we call a fusion center, because the 9/11 report said you had a failure of imagination and a failure of communication. So investigations now try not to have a failure of imagination, and they have robust communication with all the agencies that are involved. They bring them together in a fusion. That's not possible in a direct aftermath of this. So now you have the FBI doing what they do, still looking at the Republican National Convention, still with all the other investigations, still with terrorism or terrorist threat during this political season, still with what's going on in Russia and the Ukraine. The FBI have a counterterrorism and counterintelligence role in that. In the midst of that, they are trying to conduct this investigation. And at the same time, it's a fluid situation because you have the Republican National Convention. So it'll be more drawn out. But there are agents dedicated to working on this, getting his background. Again, it's not just about whether he was a 20-year-old who had gone astray. It's about who may have known. As we had to be shooting at Virginia Tech, they began to talk to professors who said, did he say anything in class? Did he give any indication of this? Did he, where he had to, so now you have to trace where the gun came from. You have to trace where he walked through the field. Did anybody notice him walking through the field? Those people who witnessed that, who said someone is on the roof, all of them have to be questioned. It has to be a thorough investigation, but it's in the midst of a situation where time is condensed, but you can't condense the investigation. So it's a complicated situation right now, which is, again, why people say, well, the head of the Secret Service didn't come out and give a press conference. No, this is it. Time doesn't allow for that right now. I know we like that here in a democracy. We like to hear right away, but it doesn't allow for that now, or otherwise he'll be giving you a press conference on 2 tragedies or 3 tragedies.
How do you think this is going to change security at the Republican National Convention? And I ask that because I remember when I covered the Democratic National Convention in Denver during the Obama's run, when I covered the Republican National Convention in Cleveland. Security was extremely tight for both of those conventions, and there were no incidents like the one we had on Saturday. I can't imagine how things are going to be for the Republican National Convention this week, Tyrone.
Yeah, they're going to move the perimeter out. There'll be less tolerance of protests that looks like they're heading towards violence. They will intercede and intervene in them, when in the past they probably will let them go a little bit further. They're not going to stop the protests. It's a First Amendment right to peaceably assemble, but they're going to, as soon as they seem to be heading a different direction, they're going to be quicker intervention. There'll be more air support in terms of drones and other technology to watch a larger area in and around. People will be checked more. And part of security, and this is an important point here, is that when you are pushing the perimeter back and you're beginning to check people as they come in, you don't get the stone face. You're actually reading people also looking for weapons. So you're being very kind to people, because sometimes that gets you the answers you want, more so than saying back up, move out, step over there, because they may step over there and find another way to get around security. So your perimeter security people are trained in reading people and looking at body language both. So you'll have more of that. But let me say this. The security for both the Republican National Convention and the Democratic National Convention, the protocols and the process was already perfect. Mm-hmm. The process for protecting this event, the procedures on paper and what the agents are trained to do are perfect. Somewhere something went wrong, just like they went wrong with George Wallace, just like they went wrong with Ronald Reagan coming out of the hotel, and you had Brady, who was actually paralyzed, and we had the Brady bill speaking of the politics, we had the Brady bill as a result of that, just like they went. So we have always said this: if someone wants to get to a high level official, whether it be a president or someone else, and they're willing to die, it's a possibility, despite all your planning, that they will be successful. If they're trying to get away, then you have a better chance of stopping that from happening, because now they got to do extra planning like an escape route. If they don't intend to escape, if they, like Oswald and Dallas, if they don't intend to escape and they're willing to die, then it's a different scenario. So the Secret Service, the FBI, the other protective agencies, military intelligence, who are also involved in this, take all of that into consideration. Do we have a person who expects for this to be a suicide bombing, so to speak? They expect not to live through this. That's a different scenario.
Matt, with the RNC starting this week, do you believe that there is going to be beyond the RNC? Do you think that this incident on Saturday has changed the posture about how the Republicans are going to look at this? I mean, Nikki Haley was not invited to speak before this incident, I should say. She has now been invited. Is that political calculus, or is that, as I mentioned, a come to Jesus moment for Donald Trump's campaign?
I guess count me as a skeptic.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, look, the reason I say it though is January 6th or Charlottesville. Let's take Charlottesville too. So Charlottesville, what happened, right? White supremacists came to Charlottesville. They committed violence. They killed a young woman. Um, and Trump basically said, yeah, find people on both sides. January 6th happened. Multiple people died. Many police officers were badly hurt, including Brian Sicknick, who died as a result. And there was no remorse. There was no statement of apology. And he's been going around the country saying these January 6th, the hundreds of people in jail for assaulting officers, breaching the Capitol, desecrating the Capitol, that they're martyrs, right? They should be released. I'm going to pardon them. So now, I see the narrative in the media that, okay, he's going to have a revelation, right? A near-death experience is going to change him. I mean, I just, again, given 9 years, I'll sort of believe it when I see it. Now, that's not to say that he won't try to strike a different tone, at the convention. But I think, and the party will ultimately take its cues from Donald Trump.
Now, what do you think this may mean for the DNC, for the Democrats afterwards? Yeah. Because we've already heard from President Biden. We've heard from him twice. We heard from him, from Delaware. We heard from him last night from the Oval Office, basically saying the same exact thing. But it almost seems to me to be a reminder of the more traditional political stance that we have seen in this country for decade after decade after decade.
Yeah, so I think the Democrats are in a tough place. Biden, in a way, has both an opportunity and a risk, right, politically speaking. The opportunity is to lead as president and kind of do what he's doing, right, or what he's been doing the last couple of days, which is, to give, send a powerful message that this violence is unacceptable, that we need to lower the temperature, as he has said, and to condemn, attacks on Trump, verbal attacks, right, that are kind of dehumanizing on the left. I think the problem is sort of greater on the right, the dehumanization problem, but certainly, it exists on the left. And so, Biden is leading, and I think this will be an opportunity going forward, politically speaking, and a responsibility as president. But the other thing is, you've also got to wage a campaign. You don't have much time to do it. He's behind in the polls. And, do you continue to, the dilemma is, do you continue to say, look, Trump is an existential threat to American democracy? How do you message that, right? So I think it's going to be a period of really trying to fumble or feel their way forward, and it's not going to be an easy. There's no playbook for this kind of campaign strategy.
Yeah, and before the incident in Butler, Pennsylvania, Biden was saying what he has always said: this is a convicted felon. Mm-hmm. We know that that is true, but as you said, moderating the rhetoric is, especially for when the person that you are campaigning against, almost lost his life, and it will be very likely that when he shows up this week, he will get this huge hero's welcome. Traditionally, the opposing candidates are quiet during the campaigns, although Trump was not during the DNC when he lost to Biden. But again, like you said, that's a difficult thing to do, to attack, not attack, to tamp down the rhetoric, to feed your base.
The only thing I would say, it may be an opportunity too. I agree 100% for Biden and the party of the Democrats to focus on the issues, poverty, the things people are dealing with. For once, maybe because you're toning down the rhetoric and not addressing Trump, you can really start talking about the economy and other things that the day-to-day people care about. Maybe this is your opportunity to give that focus and give a reason why you're giving that focus, which they haven't been doing in the last 5 or 6 months. Well, now you may have say, well, look, we're not going to talk about Trump anymore. It was a tragic situation. He went through a near-death experience. Maybe you can get to do what you should have been doing in the first place. And that is, instead of battling Trump against something, talk about what you're for and for something. So maybe this gives them an opportunity strategically make that direction. I'm not the political specialist, but
Right.
I just put it out there so that we can get maybe a point of view from Doc.
Yeah, that's an important point, actually. Yeah, so I think that's actually a really important point because there's like a structural, I think, issue with the Biden campaign, which is that in 2020, he had, I think, a pretty clear vision of what he was going to do if he won. And he had 4 crises that he'd like to talk about. The crisis of racial justice, climate change, the COVID crisis, and then the attendant economic crisis. And, he had ideas for acting on all of those. Second term, I don't think that they have necessarily figured out what it is they want to say or do, and in any kind of consistent way. So obviously you do have to draw a contrast, right? Campaigns are about choices and contrast, but at the same time, you've also got to give people a sense, as you said, right, about what people want to hear about too. Like how are you going to improve their own lives? What are you going to do? I think he started to do that before the assassination attempt, but I think that there is an opportunity to do a lot more of it.
Yeah, I think I'm going to have to allow that to be the last word. And I will say this: you may not be a political expert, but certainly, Tyrone, having known you for 23 years now, you know how the media operates, and it's quite possible that we may see a change in how pundits talk too. Yeah, it's always possible. Yeah,
always hope. Keep hope alive, right? Always hope.
Gentlemen, thank you so very, very much. I really appreciate you spending some time with me on this most important day. I really appreciate it. That is the Daily Drum for this Monday, July 15th. I'm Harold Fisher. Good night.